Yeah.
Yeah,
It'll go to 650 roughly.
I heard it.
That's the secondaries kicking in.
All right, here we go. Part 2 of the questions that you've always wanted to have answers to about the Aerostar Jet. And in this video, it's another podcast format, interviews, a couple of pictures in there. I wanted to get this thing out because there's a lot of great information in here. So it kind of starts off with the testing of the airplane and Jimmy's first flight, never having flown a jet, which is kind of interesting. And we'll go through some of the design process again. And then the question that everybody wants answered towards the end is, can I have one of these? And if I can, what has to be done? What has to happen? And what are all the ramifications? I know everybody's going to be excited about what it was like to fly that airplane for the first time. So, and what I don't know for sure is, were you the first one to fly it?
Yes.
Okay.
But I took Skip with me.
Oh, okay. So you had a second pilot up there that had built the thing. So, well, that makes sense. Yeah, Skip did a lot of the work on it. You're coming with me.
That's right.
And some of it was, we had done some taxi tests, but
Yeah.
for about a month, every day that I came into work, they said, probably going to fly the jet. Are you ready to fly the jet today? And I said, yeah, I'm ready. Let's go. Let's take it outside and fly it. Well, we got one thing we're working on, So that happened for at least 3 weeks, every day. And then one day Skip said, it's ready. Oh, really? It's ready to fly? Yeah, it's ready to fly. So I think Steve said, well, let's take it outside and let's get a group picture.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get everybody together. And I'm thinking, well, you mean in case it doesn't come back? But anyway, so we got a group picture, and then I said, well, let's go do it.
So what were you feeling?
It was kind of anticlimactic because every day I was ready.
Okay.
For 30 days or so. And then I said, okay, well, it's time to go do it. Well, let's just go do it.
Kind of like the space shuttle launch. They keep postponing it. Finally, everything's ready.
And, I was pretty sure everything would be fine. We got a certified airplane and a certified engine. It's just never the two together. But one thing we didn't quite have finished was the throttle quadrant. And so to shut off the engines, you pull the thrust levers back and you lift the locks and you pull them to shut down the engines. Well, we didn't have that figured out totally, so we had these 2 guarded switches over here. And I told Skip, well, if we land and we got too much residual thrust and I can't get this thing stopped, I'm going to tell you to cut the engines and you lift those guards and shut those switches off, So that was, and I knew he could fly the airplane, and if, anything went wrong, but so we just, and the airport manager kind of shut down the airport, and we went to the long runway to take off, and I'll tell you that I was way behind that airplane on takeoff, way behind. And we're flying VFR, so you kind of like to see traffic and whatever. So I lifted the nose and put the gear handle up. I went right through 150 knots, and it was still climbing, and I didn't get the gear up fast enough.
Also, the nose wheel
didn't come down. So then I had to slow all the way down to pull the nose up and get the nose gear to go up. And later we made it go up at a higher speed.
Yeah.
It was initially the Aerostar is 130, but it's now 140. It'll still go up, but you just have to rotate to 15 degrees, pitch up, or it's going to go right through that speed. So that was kind of a little unnerving. And then we weren't sure if we were going to get some separation off the engine nacelles, and so we slowed down to get closer to stalling speed.
Now, separation off the nacelles, what are we talking about?
Off the front of the jet engines.
Okay.
The jet engine nacelles, is air going to separate there? and cause the wing to stall.
Mm-hmm.
So we went out and flew around at 10,000 feet and it slowed the airplane down and put in 20 degrees of flaps and got down to about 110 and got a little burble.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not supposed to happen until 80, or less.
Oh, this is with flaps. Yeah. Okay.
And I said, okay, well, I don't know what that was, but I said, well, we'll just land pretty hot,
Mm-hmm.
just to make sure. And Skip said, well, you better do a flyby when you go back. So we circled and did down the runway, and we were not prepared in any production capability with cameras or anything.
Well, I found that cell phone. Somebody shot with a cell
somebody
phone, and I
shot-
published that. They
Yeah.
tens of thousands.
And everybody said, what in the heck are those yahoos doing? They're don't even have a good camera
Yeah.
for the first flight of this airplane. But anyway,
People
came
told me,
back
people accused us of that being computer generated.
oh, really?
Yeah, they
Okay.
said that's not real.
Yeah.
Their comments. You go back and look at the comments on the YouTube channel. That's not real. That's CG.
So we came in and I touched down about 110 knots, which is pretty fast.
Yeah.
Normally you touch down around 85. And we used up some runway, but the brakes were working fine and the engines went to ground idle just fine. And we taxied back and, it was kind of anticlimactic at that point. Now you have to set up to do all the real testing. And the next flight we went out and did some stalls and it was just some clear air turbulence that we felt that day.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't any separation. I mean, then we did some stalls. Steve and Skip and I were in the airplane, and it didn't stall till 75 knots or something,
So basically, the flight characteristics pretty much the same.
Pretty much the same, except that you don't need as much up elevator on takeoff. It's pretty neutral,
Mm-hmm.
and a little more pitch change because the thrust line isn't exactly the same as it was.
Yeah.
But we can always move the engine down 2 degrees, or we've never really gotten into that. But that's what you would get into to certify the airplane. Say, what's the optimum angle for the engines? It's really close, and it's certifiable.
Yeah.
As is. So.
Yeah, I think even Dick Taylor and everybody said it's beneficial to have when you put the thrust in for it to go up.
That's what the Boeing,
Yeah.
Dick Taylor, who was vice president of Boeing, said to me. That's what you want. When you bring in the thrust, you want the nose to pitch up. Okay.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, and it didn't really do that.
You certainly don't want to pull the
For-
power back and have it pitch
No,
up.
no, right, exactly.
Yeah.
So we kind of lucked out with that, but I mean, it's a great design to start with. And Ted, and your father, I'm sure, knew what they were doing. And back in the 60s when they designed the airplane.
Yeah.
That's the only reason it was even possible. There's no other general aviation airplane
They can do
with
that.
piston engines. You could do that.
Mm-hmm. It's because they had that. That's the vision was to do this. In
That's
the first
right.
place.
That's
And
right.
That's what made it all possible.
That's why it was possible.
So in that flight test program, you told me some kind of fun stories and in the past, and some of that had to do with we got a twin engine airplane, so we have VMC issues to deal with and certification to go through, and VMC is a minimum controllable airspeed with one engine inoperative, and the airplane has to be controllable. And when we're talking about 1,460 pounds of thrust on one side versus a 350 horsepower propeller engine, that had to be a little bit different. And what was the first time doing that like?
It really wasn't too bad. We eased into it, but then at one point we had a test pilot who was approved as a designated test pilot by the FAA. He flew it for us, and he evaluated VMC. And one thing about the jet engines is when you lose a jet engine, you don't have a windmilling propeller.
So I have all that drag.
You don't have all the drag on one side. So even with 1,460 pounds of thrust versus, well, that's equivalent to about 700 horsepower.
Mm-hmm.
So when you go from 350 to 700 horsepower, you'd expect the VMC to go sky high, but it didn't for a couple reasons. And one of them was you don't have the drag on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that we did when we were shutting down the left engine or just bringing it to idle for a test, our VMC was around 92 knots with the right engine at full power.
Mm-hmm.
But with the left engine at full power, it was 105, way higher. And the reason it was so high was because with the piston engines, we had Vortex Generators and other aerodynamic improvements on the vertical fin, just the left side of the vertical fin. Because when you're doing a VMC test or stall characteristics tests, you're always using the critical, you're using the non-critical engine. The critical engine's the one that causes the worst condition.
Right.
So shut down or have the left engine windmilling, the right engine at full power. So we needed right rudder power. So we fixed the rudder power issue by installing Vortex Generators and also some little fairings that faired in the cutouts for the hinge area of the rudder. And after we saw the difference in VMC, we did the same thing to the other side on the jet.
That just validated the effectiveness of those Vortex Generators.
Unbelievable.
That's
improvement.
huge.
Yeah, it was fantastic. One of the biggest improvements was you see that the rudder on the airplane, the vertical fin, is 30 degrees canted aft.
Yeah.
But the attach points for the rudder are perpendicular to the perpendicular to the leading edge of the rudder.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not streamlined.
Okay.
And when the rudder deflects, it tends to separate on those attach points. And if you look at the jet, you'll see there are little aluminum castings that fair that area in so that when the rudder is fully deflected, it's faired in.
Mm-hmm.
And we discovered that by tough testing the tail and flying in formation and looking at the tufts and seeing, okay, when do they separate? And when they separate, you lose the lift on the tail, which is 90% of the power of the rudder and vertical fin is the lift, not the deflection into the airstream. So that fixed it.
That's fantastic.
Made 92 knots on the jet. You go through that so fast. We rotate at 95.
Yeah.
And we're already at 100 by the time you reach for the gear handle. So
that's why I fly the 700. It's the same numbers.
yeah, it's the same number.
Yeah.
95 knots.
You got a lot of margin in there. Doing some of the testing and setting up the VMC with the max differential and adverse yaw and everything, you found that the rudder was actually pretty effective, even when it got slower than the 84 knots that we're used to. And a lot of people think that the rudder on the Aerostar is too small, but when you went through those tests, it just validated that no, it's not too small. It works great, especially with the Vortex Generators and the other aerodynamic enhancements that were made.
Well, years ago there was a test pilot at Piper determined that the airplane, you couldn't maintain directional control in a power-on stall until the airplane stalled. Well, the problem was that the wing wouldn't stall.
Mm-hmm.
The airplane got so slow, it got down to 65 knots, and the rudder being deflected had some separation, and it wasn't much more effective at 30 degrees of travel than it was at 10.
Okay.
And so why was that? Well, as you deflected it more and more, the leading edge of the rudder sticks out into the airstream, okay? And you got some separation off those hinge points. And by fixing that, the rudder now became fully effective at 30 degrees, where before it wasn't much more effective at 30 than it was at 10. And now it's fully effective at 30. So we had tremendous increase in rudder authority by using the Vortex Generators, which is the first thing that we did, and improved it dramatically. But when we fixed the little separation issue at the hinge points, that took care of it, and the tufts were totally attached even at full deflection. We're flying in formation, and the pilot would be full left aileron, full right rudder, flying along, and we were looking at the tail, and the tufts are all laying down beautifully.
Yeah.
Where before they were separated and didn't have as much rudder authority.
It's interesting to me how all the things that were done when you're doing that certification on the 700, how that applied to the jet.
Oh yeah.
And that to me was fascinating.
One of those certification things that we both knew, we thought, was that most of our effort in certifying this piston engine power increase is making the engine systems work properly. We don't have to worry about with the jet. It all works perfectly. I mean, I come back from a test flight, and the mechanics, Skip and Jamie, are standing there and say, "Hey, where's your squawk list?" I say, "I don't have one. Everything worked. Everything worked as advertised." Where when you're first starting with a turbocharged piston engine, and this cylinder's running hot, and we got other issues, they just work. So they burn more fuel.
Yeah.
And but you fly them differently. You go right to altitude in the jet. You don't fly at 15,000. You go right to 28 or 30 or whatever you certified to.
Or even more. So that's what was the scariest thing that happened during when you were doing the test flight?
We haven't really had anything that was scary.
Yeah, that's basically all the scary stuff happened with the original Aerostar.
Yeah, I think a lot of those.
Maybe the runway FOD tests.
The what?
Runway FOD,
Yeah.
He's laying on it with a lot of FOD on the runway.
So those were tests that you had to do?
And it came out fine.
Yeah, that was, we thought that could be an issue and might have to have a chined nose tire to deflect anything. Well, so we went to Oshkosh, and on our way back, checked the last minute and said, okay, did we check no tent? No. We're going into someplace, Billings, I think, and wasn't Billings, but somewhere else in
Lewistown, was it?
Where was
Was
it?
it Lewistown?
We went into Lewistown.
Yeah. Was that it, or was it
That-
Exeter?
I think we ended up in Lewistown.
Yeah.
But I get there, and I think it was uncontrolled, but Skip says, looks like they got trucks on the runway, on the runway, and I said, well, what about the other runways? There's 2 more runways, and he says, well, that one looks like the best one right there. We come in over the terminal building, and because the other runway was 2,500 foot usable. And I thought, well, we could probably do it if we cut both engines right at touchdown.
Yeah.
We could probably get stopped in 2,500, but I don't really want to do that. So why don't we use, Skip says, yeah, this other runway looks better. And so we made a left downwind for that runway, and we came in right over the building, and we touched we get close to touchdown, and Skip says, "Hey, there's a lot of like patches of gravel on this runway where it had deteriorated, and there's areas that are not paved."
Mm-hmm.
And so we touch down, and Skip says, "Yeah, just stay to the right, and when you turn off, just keep your speed up so you don't have to power up on this." So we kind of serpentine down the runway through these patches and turned off, and we went into this little place where they had a fuel pump and said, "We need some jet fuel," and the guy said, "Did you land on that runway?" And we said kind of sheepishly, "Yeah, well, yeah, we did." And he says, "I don't even land my 185 on that runway."
Well, that was a pretty good test.
So we dodged a bullet there.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah. You get something in that engine like a rock, that's going to be expensive.
yeah, that was going to really be expensive. But, you know, at that point, we didn't have a lot of options.
Mm-hmm.
There's airports are kind of few and far between out there in Montana.
Yeah.
But, you know, I had done some ground test run-ups to check FOD, because people are always saying, "Hey, that's down low," you know. And of course, we talked to some people at Boeing, and they said that the 737 has less FOD damage than the airplanes that have engines on the back, even though it's so close.
Yeah.
That's because, you know, the stuff off the nose wheel and stuff like it gets thrown up and gets sucked into those engines, things like that, and stuff comes off the wing and all kinds of stuff. So, but they're up front of the wing, and if you look at the Aerostar from a diameter of the inlet to how it's far off the runway, it's higher up than a 737
On a percentage basis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we put some water on the ramp, you know, and see if that would get sucked up. We had some feathers down there and stuff, but it kind of swirls, but it never gets sucked up into the engine. So we were
That's,
glad to see that.
yeah, I'll bet.
Yeah, that was really, and these engines idle down to 47.5% compressor speed.
Okay.
Most jet engines that people are familiar with are running at 85-90% compressor speed. So because of the FADAC system, they idle at 47, I think, 0.5%, and landing they're at 57, and after 8 seconds they go down to 47. So you can start both these jet engines with your feet off the brakes, and the airplane won't move.
Can't do that with a 700.
Can't do it with a piston airplane.
No.
Right.
So that
there's
answers
less residual thrust. Now we'd like to reduce that 7 or 8 seconds down to 3 seconds, because you're stopped in 7 seconds.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, we don't have a squat switch. There's a you know, a relay thing you can do with the FADEC system that when you get way on wheels, it shuts the thrust down more.
Okay.
So you have an idle and a,
we have it on the nose,
yeah,
because that's where the squat
Yeah,
switch is.
right.
We need to put one on the main,
yeah.
and then I think you can adjust that time from
Yeah.
7 or 8 seconds down to whatever you want. But that was set up for a go-around, I guess, that the engines would accelerate faster if they were already at 58% versus 47. Well, they accelerate in 2 seconds anyway.
They're fast. I mean,
Yeah.
I remember the first time I got a chance to ride in it, and I'm thinking, Jesus, acceleration on this thing on takeoff's like the Tesla. It just
throws you back,
throws
in
you
the
back
seat.
in your seat. It's
Yeah.
pretty amazing.
Yeah, and it doesn't quit. That was the thing that kind of surprised me, is once you get up to 100, 110 knots in the piston airplane, you don't feel that push in your back
Right.
anymore. You don't feel being pushed back in the seat. But with the jet, it's pushing just as hard, if not harder, after you rotate. And that just moves that airspeed indicators a lot faster than you expect.
Yeah.
To a jet experienced pilot, I'm sure they'd all say, well, yeah, who didn't know that? Well, that's the first jet I've ever flown. So I didn't know that. I didn't know how how much acceleration it was still going to have after you lift it off. But now we know.
That's amazing. you had some additional test pilots flying this airplane through the certification process. Talk a little bit about their impressions, and then also the FAA's test pilots and their impressions of this airplane when they got a chance to fly it.
Steve, you could.
Well,
the FAA hasn't.
The FAA has not.
Okay, I
flown
thought
the
there was
airplane.
There's a DER.
Okay.
A DER test
Yeah.
pilot,
Okay.
but he was working for us, not for the FAA.
Okay.
At
Yeah,
that time.
Len Fox was the guy that was flying the airplane. And of course, Gilmore talked about the people from Canada who came down. And flew it. Was there anybody else that you remember that was officially with the FAA? Or with? Seems like there was one other. At any rate, so.
Well, the guy that gave me my 6158 or my endorsement to
Yeah.
fly the airplane. We were flying the airplane with letter of authorization, and then they decided, no, that's not good enough. You need to be taking check rides in it because it's a single pilot jet.
Yeah.
And so I asked him, well, okay, fine, who's going to give me the check ride? And he said, okay, well, that's a problem because you're the only one that's ever flown it. So they did find a guy who's a super guy to deal with, John Penny, and he's out of Colorado, and he came up and we went through the process of getting approved to fly this airplane. And we started at 8 in the morning, and about 2 in the afternoon we got done, and he said, okay, you passed. And so we had to go out and do basically the same thing for ATP, fly the airplane to ATP standards.
Yeah,
and
a type rating, basically.
Yeah, basically a type rating, but of course it wasn't the same exactly, but it was very thorough.
Yeah.
And when he flew the airplane a little bit just from the right seat, he thought it was fantastic. He thought really performs on. He was really impressed with takeoff, and of course, we had to do a single engine go around. That was very impressive to him. I fortunately got the rudder in at exactly the right time on the go around because we were 3 feet off the runway with flaps and gear, of course, down. And when I brought the right engine in, I had to really stand on the right rudder at low speed, and it climbed out at 1,500 feet a minute on one engine. He was very impressed with how it flew. But he was a very experienced pilot. He was flying MiG-29s.
Oh, wow. So he's a
Over in
jet
Seattle.
jockey.
Yeah. F-86. He was a airline pilot. He flew Rare Bear in Reno. I mean, so somebody like that liked it. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, because it seems like everybody that flew it that really was impressed with the way it handles. And another story was when you were doing some stability testing. And tell me about that story where you'd pulled up and you just basically feet flat on the floor and let go.
Yeah, you had to be at full power on both engines. We were at aft CG, full aft CG, because it was a certification test flight. This was on the piston airplane.
Okay.
And 100% power on both engines and 100 knots indicated. Feet on the floor, hands off the controls, cut 1 mixture control. Count 1001, 1002, 1003, recover. And the airplane, we eased into it first. We did it at 120. I throttled the engine back, and it was very docile. And then we said, okay, well, let's just do the acid test, cut the mixture at 100 knots and see what happens. And the airplane slowly rolled into a 45-degree bank after 3 seconds. And that was it. We cut 1 mixture at 100 knots in climb at full power, and the airplane just gently rolled to the left. So you hear all these stories about, well, you know, that Aerostar, the tail's too small, this and that. It's all baloney.
Yeah. I mean, the proof is in the pudding and then especially when you put the jets on it and you get the equivalent of 700 horsepower on one side.
It's still easily controllable. Yeah, and the VMC is right there where you want to be anyway. You
Yeah.
don't want to go much below 95 knots anyway.
Let's talk about the basic performance, speeds, climb, cruise, and range as the airplane sits today.
So the takeoff performance, it accelerates to 100 knots in about 7 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
And you rotate to 15 degrees, pitch up, put the gear up, whether you need flaps or not, it's up to the pilot. I normally use them just to keep it from accelerating too fast. So I put the flaps up, and then you pitch up to 15 degrees, and you'll be at 140 or so. The gear's already up, and now you accelerate to around 200 knots, and you'll see on a standard day at gross weight, you'll see about 4,500 feet a minute.
Mm-hmm.
And it'll hold that to around 15,000, and then it's about 3,000 feet a minute all the way up to 22, and then maybe at 28,000 you're down to 1,200, 1,500 feet a minute.
Okay. Well, I mean,
At 200 indicated.
yeah, and your true air speed's much higher, obviously.
Yeah, and then in cruise you see about, coming back from Oshkosh one time, we asked for 30,000, and they gave it to us. We're not RVSM, but I told them we're not on RVSM, requesting 300, and they gave it to us. So I think it was just you and I in the airplane, Steve, that time.
Yeah, it might have been, yeah.
And we were, for the first time, we tried to keep it under about 240 indicated. One time Skip and I came back from a flight, and Steve said, we haven't done any flutter testing with that airplane, so maybe you guys ought to try to keep it down around 240 or something indicated. And I said, too late. Skip was indicating 265 or 270 on the flight back. I guess it's okay. But and then you go right to altitude, and you set up cruise, and that day coming back at 30,000, we were doing about 278 knots, I think. It was a warmer than standard day, but we were able to go to max thrust.
Okay.
Cruise detent.
Okay.
We have cruise, takeoff, and max continuous.
They said 278 knots.
Give it
indicated.
300.
No, we were truing out at 300 and I think it was 387
Okay.
was the true airspeed, and we were indicating 235 at 30,000.
And it's capable of going faster than that.
Probably would, on a standard day, but
Yeah.
temperature does make a big difference on those jet airplanes. And then landing performance is, you do want to nail your approach speed. Like I've seen videos, where people are really careful about a stabilized approach, and they nail the speed, because if you're a little fast and you pull the thrust levers back to idle, it doesn't slow down much.
Yeah.
With the props, it does. But with the jet, you do want to be established, I'd say, about, a mile out. You want to be on your speed with flaps down. And I'm normally full flaps, some power at 120 knots, and 20 flaps, a mile out, 120 knots, and when I'm about 100 yards from the runway, full flaps, the airspeed will bleed to 100.
Okay.
Come across the fence at about 100, and you're pulling the thrust levers all the way off at 100 feet, but it doesn't slow down much, and then it'll touch down at around 85, just like the piston airplane.
Yeah, the speeds and everything are the same. It's very similar to flying an instrument approach, and you're all set up, stabilized, flaps 20 and 100 120 knots indicated. And you break out, the flaps go in, you're already at 15 inches of manifold pressure at that stage. Put flaps into full, and it just kind of naturally, you don't have to do much, just keep it pitched about the same. It slows right down to 100 knots.
That's exactly what it does.
Yeah.
The only thing is if you're 110, it's going to float on you.
Yeah.
And you can't just go to idle and expect it to go from 110 to 100. It's going to take a while.
Yeah.
So that's why you need to be more precise on your airspeed.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like if you're flying the Aerostar well, and you're flying your speeds and your numbers, that this is a fairly easy transition.
I would think so. In fact, we talked about with these guys that came out from, they were in Kansas City, and the guy talked about the type rating.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I remember that.
And we said, we'd make the argument that the jet is actually easier to fly.
Of course it is.
And,
Anybody will tell you that it's
that
less going on.
we shouldn't even need a type rating because we don't have a type rating on the piston Aerostar, and it's harder to fly. And Steve said, no, don't say that, because then they'll decide we need a type rating on the piston airplane.
Well, they came close when that whole thing with the MU2 came about, and they made the special, and then we ended up going to more specialized training.
These Aerostars, they've had a bad rap, and sometimes the owners even precipitate it, by saying, oh yeah, well, they're not for everybody.
Yeah.
You got to be a real man to fly this airplane. No, that's all baloney. It's
fine.
very
it's one of the
honest.
easiest airplanes.
Very
to fly, really.
honest airplane.
A lot going on. It's fast. It's the speed that gets people mostly. They get
A little
behind
bit,
the airplane.
Get behind, yeah.
So let's see. How much fuel does it carry?
265 gallons.
And that gives you about 700 nautical miles in an hour reserve?
That's exactly what we plan.
Okay.
And I think it actually burns less. Every time we fuel up, and the totalizer might say we burned 120 gallons, or the flight plan says that, we only burned 100.
Okay. So it's just, once you dial it in some more.
Yeah, we need to, I just put in the flight plan in flightplan.com. I just put in what the citation Mustang was for fuel burn.
But this airplane probably climbs faster, so you get the altitude quicker, and you're burning less fuel, and all that stuff comes into play.
And, we were going in one time back from Oshkosh, we were going into Rapid City, and they said, well, descend and maintain 17,000, the airport's currently closed. I said, well, they've got an airplane on the runway, okay? And I thought, well, I can land on the taxiway if I have to, but I'm not coming down until we know that, we need to go 100 miles to somewhere else. So I told them, I'll just stay up here until we figure out if we need to divert. But I thought, man, we could land on the taxiway. That's wider than the runway at Coeur d'Alene. But
yeah, we had plans to raise the fuselage tank because they're, the 800 and original Aerostar had like a 100-gallon tank there, so we can get 40 more gallons.
We could probably go up to 300, Steve thinks.
Okay.
Yeah.
You can never get too much,
No, that's exactly.
And the tip tanks idea, you could put 30-gallon tips on the airplane pretty easily.
Yeah, and tip tanks done right can accomplish a lot of what the winglets accomplish.
I think so, and the 30-gallon tips that are on a Cheyenne would be about the right size for the airplane.
Oh, the ones on the Learjet are pretty nice too.
Yeah.
They got great big.
Well, yeah, and the
50-gallon size.
T33 with 300 gallons of stuff.
I think the Learjet's 300 or so too.
Yeah,
it's unbelievable.
So so here we are. We have a flyable airplane. Flies great. Looks great. Performance is outstanding. Where do you go from here? Some of the questions that I've had regarding the jet is, well, can somebody buy one of these? If someone wanted to take it to certification, what's that look like? And are there other ways? Let's just hypothetically say that somebody came and offered you a bunch of money and they wanted the jet. Is that doable? And would you even consider doing something like that?
We would consider it, you know, but that wasn't our objective to start with. But the thing about it is, you know, if we just sell the airplane, that probably makes it harder to get the thing certified. If somebody else takes the airplane, they can get it certified maybe, or at least they can operate under the current, you know, experimental category.
Mm-hmm.
But you're supposed to maintain control of it so the FAA knows the conformity is still there. So if you don't have control of the airplane anymore, then who knows what somebody else did to the airplane. So that what it means is if you did that, you'd have to find some way to transfer that so the FAA knew, okay, we're still monitoring the integrity and the conformity of the airplane as it stands. And so any changes would be documented to the FAA. Because conformity is what's important if you want to get an airplane certified.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just make the changes and say, I want an STC. Because you have to document all the stuff that goes into it.
Now that is a key point, is the airplane that we have is a conforming flight test vehicle.
Okay.
Normally people would make a prototype, you know, and go fly it and see how it performed, and nothing's documented about it.
Mm-hmm.
But this one, all the parts have drawings, all the drawings and parts have been conformed by an FAA, duly authorized FAA person. So that's why when the FAA won't get in a prototype. They won't even get in it. Yeah, that's all great, guys. We see it looks great. Now go build a conforming flight test vehicle so that we can see that what you have here is documented and that's what we're testing. You can't change it. Or if you do change it, you have to document and have all that approved, and then we'll get in it and flight test it and certify it. But that's the type certificate. It's documented exactly what this airplane is, and we've tested it and we've approved it. So that airplane is a conforming flight test vehicle. If somebody wanted to buy it, we'd have to say, well, you can own part of it. It has to stay here until we get it certified. That could cost less than probably that would probably cost less than what a really nice Aerostar would cost to get it certified. And then that benefits the company because now we have a certified type certificate for a jet version of the Aerostar. Okay, and then that person could own the airplane. And you know, if you park that airplane on the ramp next to Malibu Meridian or something for the same amount of money, somebody's going to want this one more than they're going to want the single engine turboprop.
Yep.
It's a little rocket. I had it we had a customer, and he's been a really good customer. He wanted his airplane restored, and we did that for him 10 years ago. Well, he brought it over, and he said, hey, I've got to, can you take me to Spokane? Because I got a flight. I got to go down to San Jose. And I said, well, yeah, I can take you over to Spokane, or we could just go to San Jose. I'm going to fly the jet today because I have to fly it every so often, you know. Yeah. And he said, oh, no, I've already got a plane ticket, you know, just take me to Spokane. So I said, okay, we'll get in the jet. Go ahead, you fly it. I'll sit in the right seat. So we go over to Spokane, and on final approach, he says, hey, were you serious about going to San Jose in this airplane? I said, yeah, but now we're going to have to stop for fuel and fill it up, you know. So he said, okay, well, I'll do the flight plan. He says, how long is it going to take? I said, it's going to take 2 hours to go to San Jose from Spokane. And that's, I don't know how many miles it was, 650 or something.
More than that.
Yeah, maybe more than that. We had a pretty good tailwind going down. We were doing 440 knots over the ground and doing about 380 true airspeed. But I mean, it's just a time machine. Yeah. You know, it's a fantastic airplane. And coming back, I had 100 knot tailwind or something, and I had to stop in headwind. I mean, and I stopped in Klamath Falls, Oregon. You know, and they have those, it's a joint military civilian base, and I was in there just about dark, and I got some fuel and talked to the controller, and he gave me my clearance. He said, you're cleared direct Coeur d'Alene, climb, maintain, flight level 240. And I thought, I've never gotten 240.
Unrestricted climb, yeah.
Unrestricted climb. Well, that's what they're used to.
Yeah. With
F-16s or whatever they have, the F-15s. But anyway, what a fantastic little airplane.
Oh,
you know?
yeah.
And I got a 100-knot headwind. And I said, that's fine. Just power up. I'm going 385 or so. So now I'm still doing 285 over the ground. And so it is very saleable. And, you know, you could, at some point, if you needed to change engines, now the FJ33 engine's available. It's used in several airplanes. So that would be a fairly minor change. You'd have to change the cowling. But basically, that was one of the reasons the FJ33 wasn't necessary. It didn't have a launch customer when we wanted to buy an engine. So we weren't sure if they were ever going to certify it.
That would not be good if you got the airplane done and then you decide not to certify.
They don't certify the engine. That's what happened to Ted Smith. 50 years ago. You know, so anyway, that was another reason. But Pratt & Whitney they were fantastic to work with, and the engine's done everything it's supposed to do, worked perfectly.
So this kind of begs a question. You mentioned earlier that, you know, the conforming, you know, test platform and keeping the control of all of that within, basically within Aerostar, kind of begs the question that if you were to sell it, you kind of want to sell it as a package with the whole company so that it could go through and become certified at some point, or something else. But I'm just kind of spitballing here a little bit, just throwing ideas out.
Well, I think, Jim and I think the same way. You know, since we're so passionate about the Aerostar, we want the whole Aerostar legacy to continue. Somebody's got to take over the reins of the whole thing, and with the jet in mind, I think would be the best approach.
And this would be we're approved to certify this airplane as a supplemental type certificate. So you could do 6 to 12 airplanes a year.
In a modification of the existing ones. Which these airframes, because of the way they're built and how strong they are, they're going to be around a long, long time.
They really are. I mean, there's no issues with the airframe whatsoever. It's bulletproof.
And not only that, it's still a modern design aerodynamically. So it's not been superseded by technology on the actual airplane itself.
There's nothing new since the Aerostar was developed aerodynamically.
I mean,
other than
that's superior to.
It's got high flutter margin structure. It's got a thin wing, laminar flow wing. It's just a great design.
It's got 2 engines, so you don't need a parachute.
Don't need a parachute.
These single engine turboprops have been very successful. And now they have the auto land, which takes the concern away that the pilot has a medical issue and whatnot. But that's the design we have. The 2 small jet engines, the single engine climb is 1,500 feet a minute. I mean, it's just it's a really, really nice airplane, which is what the FAA test pilot told me. And I think that's what you were referring to.
That's why I said this thing's really nice.
He was concerned about, he's heard the horror stories about the Aerostar and So we went out and did all the stall testing at AFCG, and we did VMC testing, and the next day we were going to do the dive test, and we're going to take it up. The red line is 241, and we're going to take it up to 276. Okay, indicated. And we're climbing out, and he's flying the airplane, and he said, he looked at me, he says, this is a really nice airplane. That was, you know, it was interesting to have him. He had been with it for the day, and he did everything that you would never do.
Yeah.
We're down to 55 knots and in a power on stall, and you know, we did all the VMC testing, and we were below 82 knots and cut an engine, and it still flies out of it just fine. But after he did that, the next day he was really impressed with it and said so.
That says a lot.
Now,
Now,
one other thing about the jet, it's quieter in the cabin with the jets.
oh yeah,
Yeah, which is a nice feature.
Yeah.
And there's no vibration.
Yeah.
That's why I think when I got to fly it that one time, it felt like a Tesla versus a hot rod. You know, it's just like there's no vibration. It's quiet, accelerates like crazy, and it was just a pleasure.
I was demonstrating it one day, and a guy was in the front seat and had some people in the back that he was trying to talk to them about maybe investing in it. So one day I was demonstrating the airplane to this fellow, and he had a couple other possible investors in the back seat, and he said, and we climbed up to like 10,000 feet, and I just throttled one engine back to idle, and we're flying along, and he says, why don't you show them how it flies on one engine? And I said, we've been flying on one engine for the last 5 minutes. And he didn't know it, because there's, you know, the noise and the vibrate. There's no vibration. There's not a lot of noise. There's some. I've flown in the Eclipse jet, and I was surprised how much air noise there was in that airplane. When you're going fast, you pick up some air noise. You know, when you're indicating 235, you're going to get some air noise, but there was no more air noise in the Aerostar than there was in the, you know, totally new design Eclipse airplane. So it's so far. It was so far ahead of its time. 50 years ago, it's still a modern airplane.
Oh, this is cool. Last thing, everybody's probably wondering, what is that thing with all the polka dots on it? So, Steve, what is that?
Well, this is a version of the single engine jet Aerostar. You notice that the intake's here, and it's an S duct for the engine going out the back. And the little dots are on here because we're having one of our engineers is scanning this so he can reproduce the surfaces and stuff. So these are what used when you do a scanner. It picks up the points, and you can move the scanner around it, and it'll pick up and merge all the surfaces together. This is the same thing we did on some of our cowling designs and stuff.
Okay.
Like
This
that.
is what for what purpose was that?
Just more for posterity, and again.
Oh, so we can make more models. That's just another one of the ideas that came out of it.
Or you know.
I think Williams sent us that, didn't he?
Okay.
Well, Dr. Williams had this made for us, and you know, obviously Cirrus made the single engine jet.
Yep.
So I mean, there was maybe a market for a single engine jet. So that's kind of why this was configured out. I like this configuration a lot better than Cirrus myself.
Oh, that's great. Well, I really enjoy this time, and you guys know, I mean, I'm over here quite a bit, and just love spending time because I forget a lot of it, but I learn a lot. Fortunately, I think I don't forget as much as I'm learning, but something, or I don't remember, whatever it is, who knows. But appreciate it very much, and I'll put the Aerostar links down below in the description. And if you have any questions, just call these guys. And if there's any interest in carrying the legacy forward, you know, with probably one of the finest airplanes ever built, talk to them. Sound good?
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks, Barrett.
Thanks, sir.
All right.
Good talking to you.